Do you like sports? Do you like art? What about science? Giraffes? Giraffe scientists that paint rugby games? It's all available on Audible, the biggest audiobook site with the largest selection of audiobooks this side of the inner solar system. No need to use your boring old eyes anymore. The ears are the future, my friend. Why, you're using them right now. So check out Audible and get your listen on. Go to www.readlearnlivepodcast.com/audible to start your 30-day free trial today.
And even if we do come up with alternative forms of energy, they won't replace what petroleum does. Petroleum is not a source of energy as much as a substance. The substance that's in everything we use, everything we do. Our roads are made out of it, our medicines are made out of it, our communications devices are made out of it. Even those alternative forms of energy like wind power and hydropower and things like that are highly reliant on cheap, easily available reserves of petroleum.
Hello and welcome to Read, Learn, Live, the podcast about improving yourself through literature. I'm your acclaimed host, John Monastner. I'd like to welcome you to episode 56, where we pick up sticks. As always, if you have ideas for books you'd like to see featured, or of authors you want to put me in touch with, you can reach me at jon@readlearnlivepodcast.com. Today, I'm delighted to have the opportunity to continue my conversation with author Clark Strand about his book, Waking Up in the Dark, Ancient Wisdom for a Sleepless Age. This is part 2 of our conversation, so if you have listened to the excellent part 1, please go back one episode to episode 55 and do that. I hope you enjoy the rest of our conversation as much as I did.
Yeah, I mean, it really sounds like our society is kind of built upon all these sort of band-aids to the problem, whether pharmaceuticals or
Yeah,
not, and that's not really addressing the core issue,
yeah,
and it sounds like
um,
that because that's the more difficult thing to do, right? I mean,
yeah,
it's to
yeah,
actually decide, hey, I'm going to give myself 10 hours in the dark tonight or every night even is a trade-off that it seems is probably would be difficult for a lot of people to decide that that was something they wanted to do. Um, do you feel like that's sort of that's the way forward? Like that's the trade-off we have to make, and there's not any shortcuts or anything else that can happen in order for us to recover? Because you talk a lot about sort of the dangers and the dangerous path that we're on, and how
yeah,
things are not going
yeah,
well.
yeah.
And
Well, I think that path contains within itself the seeds of his own demise, and so I don't think that I don't think it's a matter of will we ever turn off the lights, right? Will we ever go back to the way we lived before? As much as it is a question of when will that happen? How much longer do we have before that happens of its own? Because we're quickly reaching a level of crisis as a species, both because of the levels of extinction that are rising and because of climate change, when we won't be able to sustain our current levels of population. As population begins to fall, as it most certainly will before century's end, um, I think a lot of things are going to change. And will human beings find ways to sustain the sort of hyper-let cultures that they now enjoy? I don't think so. I don't think they'll be able to maintain it. And I don't think that they'll willingly give it up, but I think it'll be taken from them, just by the course of events will be such that it just won't be possible to sustain the previous levels of artificial illumination around the planet. So I think I don't think we're going to solve the problem. I think the problem will be solved for us ultimately by falling populations, probably drastically falling populations, because there isn't going to be any way that we're not going to be able to create any kind of alternative energy that will sustain our current levels of growth or even our current levels of global population. And we won't be able to use our current energy systems for very much longer. And even if we do come up with alternative forms of energy, they won't replace what petroleum does. Petroleum is not a source of energy as much as a substance. It's a substance that's in everything we use, everything we do. Our roads are made out of it, our medicines are made out of it, our communications devices are made out of it. Even those alternative forms of energy, like wind power and hydropower and things like that, are highly reliant on cheap, easily available reserves of petroleum. So even those alternative forms of energy are ultimately, dependent upon petroleum. So so I don't think that I think this is a problem, and I think the problem is going to get worse before it gets better, but that it's going to get a lot better uh, faster than faster than we can prepare for.
Yeah, that's
Simply,
a
simply because I don't think that there's any way we can sustain it. And the more people we have, the greater the burden, and the higher we climb, the further we fall. So,
mm,
uh, but I think that there's something people can do now though to begin to reclaim their sanity, and that is to cultivate the dark. There are two types of dark. There's literal dark and the cultivated dark. And what Ware discovered, or the conclusion that he arrived at the end of his study was that what people are doing today when they're meditating, doing yoga, lying on an analyst's couch in a darkened room, you know, a lot of these practices are attempts to regain this lost connection with the numinous, with the spirit realm that we tended to lose as modern people. Ware said that ancient people would have considered this their birthright, right? They sort of took it for granted. And although he doesn't actually come out and say this, I think he would agree with this. He almost gets there. His area isn't religious studies, and so he doesn't tend to think of it in this way. But I think that religion is basically invented as a way of protecting and reclaiming the dark. I think that the lost experience of darkness is the origin of religion. I think human beings began to lose touch with it, and they created religion as a way of trying to sort of keep some contact with it.
mm,
And so there are all these practices, everything from the rosary to Buddhist meditation to yoga. There are practices that people can engage in that get them back in their body, back to their natural rhythms, and back in touch with their roots in the deep past. And I think that anything that does that, any way of cultivating the dark, right, helps you. And then as that happens, you begin to, I think, naturally seek out more tranquil environments, little less brightly lit, a little less frenetic, a little less driven by the culture. You begin to become more centered in your own uh, true needs and desires rather than being sort of pushed around and manipulated by the culture. Become to come back to yourself a bit more. So I think that people can do that, and I think a lot of people are doing that now. They're cultivating the dark. They wouldn't call it that, but when I look at them, that's what I see. The yoga studios, they're cultivating the dark. Mindfulness movement, they're trying to cultivate the dark.
yeah, I think that's a really great point, and I think it's somewhat heartening, right? Because there, like you said, there is definitely some sadness ahead of us, and I think it's heartening for people to know that there's still some good that they can do for themselves,
Yeah,
and that there's still some good steps they can take. But I kind of want to go back to the very beginning of our discussion, and
yeah,
you mentioned that this whole book was to tie in these last three pages, the Gospel
yeah,
according to the dark.
yeah,
So I hadn't realized that came from somewhere else. So maybe talk
yeah.
about where that came from, and how you became acquainted with it, and why you felt that you needed to basically write a whole book in order to get that message across.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think the best place to start is kind of at the beginning. I was a Zen Buddhist monk. I was trained to be a Zen teacher. In 1990, I left that world behind right when I was on the verge of becoming a Zen master. Zen is a very, very patriarchal tradition. I mean, so patriarchal, so unrepentantly patriarchal, in fact, that it there are few traditions to really compare it to. It's a boys' club from beginning to end, going all the way back to the Buddha.
Yeah.
So I was very committed to that. I was very much thought in those terms. I was raised a Southern Protestant, became a Zen Buddhist when I was 19 and devoted myself to it until I was like 33 years old. Uh, then I studied, once I left Zen, I studied religion, but all the religions I studied, without my even really realizing it, were further patriarchal traditions. So I was deeply immersed in this religious way of thinking that was really lopsided and very, I think at this point kind of wrong-headed from the beginning. Historically and in its present incarnations as well. And so I had no interest in the divine feminine or anything like that. I had no connection to it. I had no books on my bookshelf about the divine feminine, except I think the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, which I'd read several times without realizing that the whole thing was about the Divine Mother. So anyone who's read the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna knows that that's on every page, and it's the point of that book. How I could have read it 2 or 3 times and come away from that reading experience not knowing what that book was really about gives you some idea of how deeply immersed I was in that all male kind of spiritual culture. So that's where I was in June of 2011. I had been getting up to go on these walks at night all my life. This was a night like any other. It was a full moon. It was beautiful out, perfect kind of weather, cool, crisp, moonlit, got up to go for my walk. I put my hand on the doorknob to leave the house, and I felt a hand on my shoulder. And a male voice, spoke into my ear and said, "Don't go out tonight. Remain inside and be very, very still." Now, I had only heard this voice once before in my life when I was on a plane I thought was going down. And I asked him, I didn't know who I was even talking to, God, Buddha, whatever. I said, "Are we going to die?" And the voice said, "No, I don't think so," which is very comforting.
Ambiguous, but yeah.
Ambiguous, but ultimately comforting. And in fact, we were fine. Uh, but that's the only other time in my life I'd ever heard the voice. And so I decided to trust it. I really wanted to go for a walk. That's what I do. I love it. I love it more than anything. So, but I went and I sat on the couch and I hadn't been a Zen monk for, at that point, I hadn't been a Zen monk for over 20 years, but I still have that ability to quiet my mind. I've done other practices and I've sort of never lost that knack. So I just made my mind very, very still, especially at that time of night. It's that prolactin level, it's high. So I got in that very still place. And I was there for about 45 minutes. I had my eyes closed. And then I felt the presence. I felt that there was a presence in the room. I don't know how to describe it. It's just there was somebody there. I could feel somebody right in front of me. And so I opened my eyes and I saw the face of a girl, roughly like 17 years old, a young girl, short auburn hair, pale skin, freckles around her nose, hazel eyes. And she had an X of black electrical tape over her mouth. And I'd never had a vision of any kind like this before. I don't think I'd ever had a vision, period, or much less witness an what they would call in the literature on such things an apparition. So, but I was in that still, calm place, and her eyes were very, very urgent looking, like not pleading exactly, but like she wanted to get through. And the only thing I could think was that I didn't know how the tape had gotten on her mouth, but I knew it was wrong and it had to come off. And so I reached out and with, being careful not to actually touch her, didn't feel right to touch her. I didn't feel like I dared to touch her. I didn't know who she was, but I never had an experience like this before, but I felt it wasn't right to touch her. But I managed to get a hold of the tape and I pulled it off, and it pulled off just like skin, if it were attached to your mouth. I could feel the pull of the skin against it. And then she let out a like a sigh, but it was a weird sound. It was like a crypt being unsealed or a cavern being opened after thousands of years. It was like air rushing in. And I started to speak, and she shook her head It's like, no, can't talk, not now. And we stared at one another for a while, and then I closed my eyes. I mean, I'd been taught as a Zen monk that these experiences were called makyo, or illusion, and they happened in deep meditation. So I had been trained. Not only had I been trained, but I had trained other people to ignore experiences like this, right? So I just closed my eyes again after this. Like, okay, that's that, right? And 45 minutes later, I opened my eyes again and she was gone. But it wasn't illusion. It wasn't Makio, right? And this has made me, I don't know, rethink many experiences I had when I was a monk, that I just dismissed. Many experiences I've had all my life that I've always dismissed. And the rational part of my brain would step in and say, no, that didn't happen, or no, that's not real, or no, I didn't hear that, or no, where did that thought come? That's ridiculous, dismiss that. And but the difference was that the next day I woke up and I could feel her next to me. I couldn't see her, but I could feel her next to me. And I could, for 2 weeks solid, if I was awake and conscious, I could feel her like literally right next to me, like less than a foot away from my left shoulder. And so I knew that she was there, and it's a continuous presence. She didn't say anything or do anything, but she was just there. So 2 weeks later, I woke again. I mean, I've been waking up every night, right? But 2 weeks later, I was going out for my walk again. And I had my hand on the doorknob, the same hand, placed on I felt the hand on my shoulder, and the same voice said, "Stay in, don't go out, be still." So now I knew what to expect, and so um, I got on the couch and I meditated. I got really still, and at a certain point, I felt her presence, and I opened my eyes, and she was there. And now it's just like you can imagine, after 2 weeks of this, I'm like ready to explode. I don't know what's going on. I don't know who
Yeah.
she is. I'm just, my whole being is just one giant urgent question, which is, who are you? Right.
Yeah.
And I ask her, and she says, I am the hour of God. And that was a term that I'd been using to describe my waking up in the middle of the night. For years, I've been describing my experiences during that time as the hour of God, especially since I discovered Reb Nachman and the Carthusians and, the various Buddhists and Muslim and Jewish, other practitioners, what they had experienced during that hour. I sort of thought of it that way. And I said, in response to her, I think I know what that is. And she said, I think I understand what that is. And she said, if you really understood, you would have said who, not what. And that was, for me, a watershed. I mean, that was a watershed moment. Like, it's almost like seeing her was, witnessing an apparition was startling enough,
Yeah.
but it didn't affect my consciousness fundamentally in any way. It didn't give me any understanding. I didn't really understand what had happened to me or what the significance of it was. But when she said that, I suddenly looked at the world in a completely different way. Like, I woke up the next morning a different person. I just, like, the whole world was filled with who's, not what's. Like, our whole way of thinking of things as ourselves as the only subjects in existence, and everything else is an object, right? That was wrong. That the whole world was alive and everything in it was alive and sentient in some sense. And so, she continued to, I continued to feel her presence, and she began to speak, and I began to write down what she was speaking. This lasted through the summer. She woke me one night on Cape Cod and said, if you rise to say the rosary tonight, a column of saints will support your prayer. And I remember thinking in the morning, well, I'm not Catholic or Christian, but I'm also not stupid. The only figure I've ever heard of who invites you to pray the rosary and makes a promise based on that is the Virgin Mary. And I had this sense that the Virgin Mary I was witnessing wasn't anything like that would be recognizable to a Catholic, right? I knew from the beginning that that this figure was not prim or pious or prissy, and she wasn't under anyone's thumb. I mean, she wasn't going to get with the Catholic program and like, you know, uh, the sort of anti-communist, anti-abortion, anti-feminism kind of thing. She was not that kind of virgin.
Yeah.
So I knew I was dealing with a very different figure, but I did start to pray the Rosary, and I started to experience through praying the Rosary, even though I wasn't Catholic or Christian, that an opening during the day uh, that sort of cultivated darkness that I had previously only experienced at night or during in the depths of like a meditation retreat. That became very easily accessible to me as a result of praying the Rosary. But then that fall, one day, I she had told me that I should write a book and about these experiences, and I was one day I was saying the Rosary upstairs in bed in the middle of the day. I was lying on the bed. The house was empty. The kids were out. My wife was out, and I said out loud, I said, "How can I write a book about something I don't understand?" Like I don't really understand I don't really understand what's happened. I don't really understand, who, you know, I don't know what you want me to do. I don't know what this
Yeah.
means. I don't know what does it mean that the Virgin Mary is appearing outside of the Catholic Church that doesn't care about religion anymore and only wants to talk about, species extinction and climate change and the path forward for humans. Like this is a much older girl than the Christians are talking to, and but I had no idea where to begin to write such a book. And then I looked and she was there again. So this is, she appeared very seldom. I would hear her speak, but I would very seldom see her. And that day I saw her, and she came close and she took my hand and put my hand on her chest, and she put her hand on my chest, and she said, "Now write." And I lost consciousness. It's like I passed out. I don't remember anything. And when I came to, about, I don't know, maybe 20 minutes later or 30 minutes later, there was a notebook next to the bed and my handwriting, and there was the Gospel According to the Dark. I don't remember her saying a word of it or anything. I don't remember her dictating it. All of the last thing I remember is her touching me. And then I just lost consciousness. When I came to and I read this Gospel According to the Dark, and I read this for those last 3 pages of the book. I was the first reader, the first person to read them. Um, and I read them and I thought, I think that was when I really, really understood, certainly when my wife understood, that this is not like some archetypal part of my brain talking to me. This is like, this is something so far beyond that. Like those last 3 pages, I couldn't have written them.
Mm.
I would never have written them. I would never have thought them. I could never have written something like that. Would have written it, and I didn't understand it. And I spent the next several months like trying to understand the message of what she had said and the gravity of it, the scope of it. And as I did that, the rudiments of the book and what I had already written and the way it all fit together began to sort of form in my mind. And so that's sort of the genesis of the book. It sort of wrote itself backwards from that point on. The whole book became a way of sort of explaining for people, the uh, preparing people to read, a modern, sort of eco-apocalyptic gospel, which is basically what it is.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really powerful. And it's so interesting that that you got that message and then really took the time to make it happen. You sort of you wrote all that down and you said, okay, like this is my mission, and you worked
Yeah,
at it and kind of put together, or you worked with your wife, and you kind of now you've got the book. And I think that's yeah, it's a testament to your efforts, because I think
yeah.
it could have very easily just have you could have gotten that and moved on. And so I think
No, there was
it's
never any way I was going to move
no,
on. It was
you were
too
locked in.
No, yeah, there was never any question.
Yeah.
I mean, there was never any question that my life would go back to being what it was before after that initial encounter. But once I read the gospel according to the dark, I knew that my understanding of life would be completely different going forward. And I knew that I had a sense, I think, that I would the rest of my life would be about sharing that message and sharing that message with other people and sort of building community based on that. So
Yeah, and to kind of connect to that, I know you're involved in community building in some of other aspects of your life. I mean, what else are you doing in terms of building community and bringing people together?
in a number of the Catholic modern apparitions of the Virgin Mary, she begins to behave in ways that break set a bit. Like she begins to tell the visionaries she's speaking to invite everyone to pray the Rosary, whether they're religious or not, and not as a way of converting them to Christianity or Catholicism, right? Just the Rosary. And so as I began to research the Rosary and read about it, I discovered that it was much older than Christianity, that it was, in fact, a kind of an eco-feminist, you know, form of goddess worship, that it existed long before the Christian church came to be, and that the Catholic Church had done what it often does with these ancient practices, which was sort of graft them onto its own theology. Like the Virgin Mary, if you look at the iconography associated with Mary and you look at the stories about her, you realize that they're the same stories that have been sort of recycled from older figures, Venus, Isis, Inanna. The story goes back. So the figure that Christians call the Virgin Mary is basically a much older um, uh, uh, goddess figure that has been it's sort of like the bedrock of human consciousness going all the way back through the Upper Paleolithic. You find these little images of her all throughout Europe in the same areas where the rosary became very popular. You find these little images of Paleolithic goddess from like 35,000 years ago. And as I began to read more and more about that, I began to realize that um, the rosary was really older and bigger than religion. That it was a sort of an eco spiritual practice more than a religious practice. So I began to share that idea with friends, and people just it just took off. I mean, people wanted to do it. We have Jews in our group. We have Buddhists in our group. We have, you know, Catholics in recovery, former Catholics. We have a few practicing Catholics. We do have some, but by no means are they the majority. And if then those Catholics who belong to our group are very, very progressive
Yeah.
Catholics. I mean, these are not abortion these are not anti-abortion activists exactly. These are people who are very, very much on the feminist, progressive side of things. But we have a very broad range of people, and we have members all over the world. And Perdita and I just finished writing a book called The Way of the Rose. It'll be out in November. That's about this, and it continues the story of the apparition, sort of where Waking Up to the Dark leaves off. It sort of continues the story. But yeah, so that's pretty much what we do. We travel around and talk to people, get groups started, help groups get started, and it's all about getting recentered back in your own lives, so that it's building small, independent, resilient groups. That our groups aren't. There's no money involved. There's no leaders. It's these are self governing groups that sort of take care of themselves, and it's about building very, very close spiritual friendships. It's based on a model of spiritual friendship rather than a model of spiritual authority. Perdita and I are not like leaders of the group or anything like that. We're facilitators. We're the people who we sort of try to help people make things happen. And we've written a lot of the literature that the group uses, but we're not its leaders. Doesn't have a leader.
Right. And how can we people get involved if they want to maybe start one of these communities or join a community that
Yeah,
exists?
Well, the best thing to do is to get on Facebook. We have a very large and very active Facebook group called Way of the Rose, and people, most people, are involved either in a local group, or on the Facebook group. And we also have a website, wayoftherose.org, which we've just created and are beginning to populate. I mean, we have years of Facebook posts, and we have so many writers on our Facebook group.
Yeah.
So they're just voluminous writings about the Rosary and Our Lady and ecology and women's rights and, modern spirituality and, you know, I mean, so it's like a library of, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of words of writing, like articles that people just write and post to our group, just because they feel passionate about the subject.
Yeah.
And so that's really where we have to go back through for the website, and populate it with sort of the greatest hits. But the only place where the full record of the group exists is on Facebook in the archives. They're just, going back years. So
Yeah. That sounds great that you were able
yeah,
to build such a large community.
yeah,
Cool. Well, this has been an amazing interview. I like to do a couple of thunder round getting to know you questions, and
yeah.
we'll wrap it up and call it a day. All
All
right.
right.
What
Yeah.
is your favorite food and or drink?
Well, favorite that asking me my favorite food is a little bit like asking an artist what their favorite color is.
Ooh,
I love
okay.
all
Yeah,
all kinds of food,
that's
but
right.
coffee is my favorite drink, and probably after that would be bourbon.
Okay, fair. Where's your favorite place you've ever been?
That's easy. The Grotto of Bernafal in just outside of Les de Théac in the Dordogne region of France. It's
Hmm.
an old cave owned by a family. It's a privately owned Paleolithic cave with art in it going back about 17, 18,000 years into the Magdalenian period, which is the period directly before the creation of agriculture. And it's sort of this is a period of the great flowering of human culture. Human beings had all the riches of culture, but none of the miseries of civilization at that point. So
Mm.
it really is it's kind of the peak. It's kind of peak human.
Huh.
That's the way I think of it. This cave is like a cathedral a smallish cathedral with its painted bisons and
Yeah,
mammoths and stuff. It's sort of a tribute or a cathedral to the peak human era.
right. To that part of our history.
Yeah, yeah.
All right. Well, last question. If you could wave a magic wand and change any one thing, what would it be and why?
Well, I would have to have two magic wands. I'd have to have
Okay,
a magic wand to turn off the lights,
got it.
okay? And I would have to wave a magic wand to minimize simultaneously to minimize the suffering, the short-term suffering that would cause, because it would cause, like if the grid just went down, all of a sudden,
Yeah,
it would cause phenomenal levels of human distress and death and suffering. To lose the grid, that fast. I'll just close with a weird piece of trivia.
I'm ready.
The what was then the largest blackout in human history took place on my birthday in,
Ooh.
I believe, 2003. I was coming back from the city on a bus. A white pine tree brushed against a trunk line in Ohio, and the relay systems were faulty, and it brought down the entire grid across the Northeast and up into Canada. It was the largest blackout in human history. And I came in on the bus to a completely dark town. It was my birthday. I'd been in the city on business. And I walked home from the middle of town where the bus dropped me off through the dark, walked into our house lit only by birthday candles. My wife and the kids had waited up for me, and my wife said, "Happy birthday."
Yeah. Wow. What a birthday present.
What a birthday present.
That's incredible. Yeah, I remember hearing about the blackout. That's incredible. That happens on your birthday.
It did.
Uh,
And but then, then again, I had deadlines and work to do, and I was very grateful, like when 8 hours later the power came back on, I was able to
Yeah,
get back to my computer.
yeah, it's that conundrum. We want to be disconnected and connected.
So I
Uh,
need two magic wands.
yeah, two magic wands. I like that approach.
Yeah.
All right, well, Clark, thank you so much for joining me. The book again, Waking Up to the Dark. It's fantastic, as I'm sure all of you that are listening have gathered, and it's really just an interesting book to read about where we are today and where we're coming from and where we're going. So I would highly recommend it. Clark, thanks again for being on the podcast.
Thanks so much, John. It's a pleasure.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Read, Learn, Live. If you liked it, tell a friend and subscribe on iTunes and Google Play. If you hated it, tell a friend and subscribe on iTunes and Google Play. And so it goes.